Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Tom Williams. I'm looking after programs and customer services. I'd like to run you through pretty quickly where we are in terms of each of the serial programs that are running today. They're still very much, of course, the bread and butter part of the business and what's paying for most of our developments and the other good things that are going on. So quickly then, I'll start with A380. I think Fabrice talked about where we are in terms of the backlog. I think the more important thing you can see here, 40 million passengers, and certainly for those people that fly on it. Probably the key issue, and certainly one of the strong feedbacks that we get from the airline, is that the so-called honeymoon effect of a new aircraft has actually lasted far longer on the 380 than on any other new program that's been introduced. And we still have this sense that people are going out of their way, paying a premium even, in order to fly on the 380, and that's been a pretty universal feedback that we've had. Fabrice talked a little bit about what we're doing in terms of the technical performance of the aircraft. And clearly, as time goes on in any airframe, not just in Airbus, but in any airframe company, you've got the opportunity to learn more about the performance of that airframe. At the beginning, you tend to take a rather careful approach, conservative, you keep some margins, some allowances. And then as the engineers get a little bit more used to it, they start to open them up. We also clearly learn some lessons from one program to another. And so you can see an example here in terms of gust load alleviation. And that's our ability to use the control surfaces on the wings, and these are big wings, of course, to actually manage the load across the span of the wing. The system is so sensitive that we can move the flight controls based on sensing of what we see in terms of the gust conditions and the general air conditions around the aircraft. That gives us a margin that we get from those better control surfaces that we don't need to achieve by putting metal in place just in case it might be needed. So that gives us the opportunity to go and make further refinements in terms of the aircraft's performance. We've also done a little bit of structural reinforcement on the centre wing box, but not very much. Just a little bit of tweaking, I should say. And as a result of that, you can see the growth that we've got with something like 15 tons improvement in max takeoff weight, 8 tons in maximum zero fuel weight, and 8 tons in maximum landing weight. And of course, we've also done a little bit of work on twist. For those that are not aerodynamicists, there is the ability to actually induce a little bit of twist into the wings. We did have twist on the wing when we originally built it. As we gain more experience, we've learned to tweak that twist. And we're talking here half a degree, something like that. But by further tweaking of the wing twist, we can further optimize the aerodynamic flow, especially on the outer part of the wing. And again, that helps us to reduce the induced drag situation and better improve the aerodynamic performance. So you can see here a sense of flexibility about the aircraft, and what we're trying to do is offer the customers the options to make different permutations on different routes. For those customers that want very long-range missions, or for those customers that are looking for a more regional route, or even to mix the same aircraft on different routes. And of course, the other thing that's very important here in this chart is the QC1, and I think you'll see a little bit here as we've tweaked performance, and probably a little bit more with this chart. You can see that with QC1 capability, you can see the departure range coming out of London Heathrow, which is probably the most sensitive in terms of QC1. And you can see the range at QC2. And what that gives is the opportunity for the airlines to fly into curfew-restricted airports. So if you've flown down to Sydney, you'll know that if you end up changing or doing a stop in Bangkok, you'll see the A380s leaving earlier than the other aircraft. And that's because they're allowed to come into Sydney much earlier in the morning than a non-A380 aircraft. And that's just because of the quietness of the aircraft. So certainly for those airports that are slot restricted or airfield restricted, because they're worried about the environment and the noise around about them, and I think with the tremendous noise capability of the aircraft, its performance, for those of you that have flown on it, you'll know that it's incredibly quiet aircraft. You know, most people when the aircraft takes off, the ordinary passengers are looking around and saying, have we taken off yet? because they don't have that sense of what does it take to get a 560 or even 570 ton aeroplane off the runway. So it really starts to open up that opportunity to fly into different destinations. And I think as Fabrice had said, when we talked about the destinations we would fly the aircraft to, we originally had about 26 major destinations in mind. We certainly didn't have Manchester in mind, it wasn't one of our destinations. But here you are, you can see Emirates going to Manchester every day with a very good load factor using the A380 and even looking at doing more frequencies on some of these routes. So I think that the aircraft intelligently used really starts to open up new business opportunities for the airlines. We've done some further improvement in terms of the weight options. We've also looked at the lightweight antennae, which gives us the ability to hopefully not just reduce weight, but also reduce drag. Because as we get into a situation where people want more and more IFE, and in particular interactive IFE, with things like live television, GSM, phones, then you end up with an antenna that gets bigger and bigger. And the antenna itself can be both a weight and a drag factor on the aircraft. So it's a very intelligent use of antenna. The gust load alleviation I've talked about, and the TCAS in terms of the autopilot and flight director, the ability to have a much better sense of not only terrain and collision, but also a sense of what other traffic is in the area, who's the aircraft that's climbing, who's descending, and what trajectory are they on. And then with the autopilot, making adjustments on that flight trajectory to give a safer approach. And that in turn allows for a denser airspace with still a very good level of safety. The engines, we continue to get good improvements, and both of the engine guys have continued to tweak further performance out of the aircraft, and that'll be an ongoing evolution. We'll never stop that process of trying to improve the engine performance. I think the wing rib feet, I don't want to bore you with the wing rib feet, because some of you listened to me last year and it was a long and nauseous presentation where I took you through all the ins and outs of wing rib feet. So I think everyone's now an expert on wing rib feet. Those that haven't, see me afterwards and I'll give you a little class on wing rib feet. I think the main message here is that we've got the situation now under control. We've got a very good plan in terms of what we're doing. For the aircraft that were already equipped with the carbon fibre wing ribs, we've got to change to the metallic booms to go to a different aluminium alloy. We've got a different profile on that boom so that it gets a stronger, more stable joint. And clearly we've approved all that with the airworthiness authorities. It's now been certified. And at the same time, we said that even if we were modifying an aircraft that had the current carbon fibre ribs, once they complete this modification, we fully are guaranteed to reinstate the 19,000 cycles design service scope. So we're very comfortable about that. And those aircraft are going into service now. You'll remember there was a mixture of aircraft. In the case of some airlines, they wanted to do the modification in 2 or even 3 steps, which would be in line with their C-checks, so that they would minimise the amount of downtime. Other airlines took an alternative approach to say, let's just do all this in one go. We'll ground the aircraft, we'll do other modifications and upgrades while we're there, but we'll basically hit it in one go, get all the modification done, and then we don't have to worry about it again in the future. The BA aircraft, for example, that will be flying at Le Bourget, it's had its wings fully modified now and will go into service with no further modifications required. You remember also we said for the longer term, we would go back to an aluminium rib. And in fact, the first aluminium ribbed aircraft for one of our key customers is going through the shop just now, and that will be delivered in 2014. So you can see that there's a strong trend towards the production building back up and getting back into a more normal kind of production flow. The A380 for BA, we look forward to that. You'll see it in Le Bourget, and then very quickly going into service after that. The 330, I think we continue to have a very strong 330 programme in spite of all the concerns and issues. I think the flexibility of the programme, you see it here in its, not only in its passenger options, but in freighter option, as a VIP aircraft, and of course increasingly now as a tanker aircraft. And it's been very successful in entry into into service in Australia, the Middle East, and of course with the RAF, who I think would tell you that they're delighted with the performance of the aircraft, very quickly becoming one of the most reliable aircraft in the RAF fleet. So still with a strong backlog. I think the production levels we're building up. We're certainly keeping our level at 10 aircraft a month is the plan that we have. You do remember we talked before about going to 11 a month. We've held off on that decision, and that's because of the ETS situation. We're going into a pretty complex situation in China, where we had quite a number of A330 orders in our backlog, over 40, where we had orders from the customer, PDPs, etc., but the aircraft were blocked because the Chinese objected very strongly to the implications of ETS, particularly the extraterritorial aspect of tax collection on an aeroplane flying over Chinese airspace. So we've spent a lot of time trying to convince the European Commission that we needed to have a more sensible approach, and in particular to have a global solution, because the objections came not only from China, they came from America, from Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Russia. Many nations objected to this extraterritorial aspect. I think after quite a bit of lobbying and discussion, we managed to convince the European Commission that this was an issue far better resolved in the forum of ICAO, and ICAO are now working on it, and we hope that they'll come with a global solution that'll have everyone's agreement and buy-in. We recognise that that might be a difficult thing to do. So in the meantime, we're keeping to the rate 10. We still have those orders in the backlog. We still hope to convert them. We are converting some of them, but we're not at the point where we feel confident enough to fully go press ahead for rate 11. Operational reliability on the 330 remains extremely strong. I think if you talk to any of the airlines, people like Singapore or Cathay that are operating the aircraft, they would say it's a real profit machine, very reliable aircraft, and robust, really fits well into the route structure. And if you don't need the range of a 350 or a 787, it's available now. It'll fit well into the route structure, and you know, it's got a lot of capability. We should also not forget that we keep on working to improve the 330, and a little bit of an evolution here as we went through from 1998, from when the aircraft first went through its kind of early services, from 94 to 98. We had the 330, 300, and then the 200. And of course there was a number of enhancements in terms of flight deck technology, cabin, etc. And that led us to quite a big step in engine enhancements that came through in 2011. So we continue to spend money, but of course the kind of things that we expect to get with that are ETOPS. We now go to 240 minutes, where we were at 180 minutes on ETOPS. Again, smaller, more efficient SATCOM antennae, traffic awareness, TCAS, required navigational performance with much tighter tolerances, on-airport navigation systems with moving map, so the pilot on very complex airports always knows where he is and has an awareness of the traffic round about him. Improvements in the FMS, not only in the FMS itself, but in the landing system, ground handling system, and things like runway overrun protection, very important in airfields that are perhaps flooded or with very poor lighting or whatever else it might be. So there's a number of issues that give the pilot some additional tolerance, some additional safety in some of the more difficult applications in airports around the world. Connectivity, we've made very good progress with connectivity with iPad now running with several customers, has been running for some time, mobile phone and email, and full audiovisual on demand, the flexibility at every seat to full AVOA AD. And of course those enhancements keep going, and we announced last year the launch of the 242-ton version, and really what drove us to that was to look at, again, some lessons that we learned. We looked at the wing, and in particular we looked at how we could tweak the aerodynamic performance of the 330. And we realised with some relatively minor changes in terms of flat track fairings, flat length, we could do some aerodynamic cleanup, giving some useful fuel burn improvements. We also looked at things like engine performance, and again, the engine guys had some little tweaks, each bringing maybe around 1%. We had the load alleviation function. We had the capability, again, to use the actuators on the flight control surfaces. But again, with lessons learned from A380, we brought that back into the 330. And again, that allows us to reduce some of the outboard loading on the wing. And of course, the other thing is that we had the opportunity on the Dash 300, we hadn't put fuel in the centre tank of the 300. So that gives us 139,000 litres of additional fuel capacity. So we're really using something that was already there, was well established on the 200, but gives us more capability on the 300. And what that means is, if you look at a previous mission, if you fly 400 passengers, 95 kilos each, you can see the 5,200 nautical miles of range. If you go down to 300 passengers, you didn't actually get much benefit in terms of range, because you came up against the 5,700 miles in terms of the fuel capacity. With that additional capacity, you go out to 6,100 miles. So that really opens up, again, some additional markets. And you can see the evolution of the 330-300 as it's gone through its various iterations. And it really starts to open up a lot of capability on the aircraft. The freighter, a very good program in terms of project management, cost, and in technical performance, actually did better than we had in the initial requirements. Our only issue with the freighter, of course, was that we launched it into probably the worst freighter market ever. Because while RPKs had continued to grow on the passenger side, pretty much in line with the kind of 4% trend, mainly driven, of course, by places like Asia, India. At the same time, we saw ton kilometres really plummet. And we can really see then that that's had a big impact. There's a lot of freighters, dedicated freighters, parked up in the desert today. And so it's a difficult sell at the moment to convince airlines that they ought to go with an all-new freighter. Some of them still are, and they're delighted with that performance. But the freight market is difficult. Our expectation is that market will come back, but it could take another couple of years before we really see it. And we recognise that there may well be some sea change in terms of how freight is moved around the world. You know, the high-value goods that were traditionally being moved by air freight, I think a lot of that started to move back to sea freight, and it'll be interesting to see if and when that trend changes. I think in terms of the programs, you've probably seen, you know, great aircraft, good performance, and we also, I think the punchline there is that we see the 330 and the 350 not as competitors, or not as one replacing the other, but as complementary aircraft. 320 is still very much the volume part of the business. FAL's producing at a record rate. I think the main comment to make there would be that as we went through last year, some of you have heard me say this already, we probably had the toughest year end that I can remember in any time. I mean, I came into lead programs in 2005. And every time we've made a schedule change up until then, it's actually been a relatively smooth process. We give the suppliers about 18 months visibility of any schedule change, and that's because we want them to have the ability to invest in infrastructure, people, machine tools, raw materials, whatever it happens to be. And generally speaking, when we've made a change, it goes pretty well. Usually the first month, 6 weeks, you get a little bit of perturbations, and then generally it settles out pretty quickly after that. That certainly wasn't the case last year. As we went through rate 40, it was very difficult. As we went through the mid-year, about this part of the year, we thought we were in a difficult crisis, but seeming to improve. But then it actually got worse as we went through into the third quarter. And for those of you that would have visited perhaps Hamburg, if you'd gone there in, say, October of last year, you would have seen a situation where it was a bit like an airport. There were airplanes parked everywhere. In fact, at one stage, at the end of October, beginning of November, we had 26 aircraft parked out of sequence, in addition to the normal flow. And there was a lot of people around the organisation, including some of our own, and some customers, who were betting that we would never recover that for year end. I'm pleased to say we did. I mean, with pretty superhuman efforts. We delivered, of course, 72 aircraft in the last month of the year, not just single aisle, but across all the programs. That was a very difficult challenge. We were working around the clock. really pushing people to the limit to get things done. So it was a real sign of the commitment of Airbus people and how they perform. But it's really not what we want to do. It's not a sustainable industrial model. And so there was a lot of work going on in parallel in the supply chain, and for those that are interested, I can talk about that either in Q&A or even this evening. But we've done a lot to try and inject a lot of additional resource into the supply chain. We've had, in some cases, to intervene directly into the supply chain, either actually taking a management ownership in some of our suppliers, injecting money, injecting our managers and talent in order to help manage the problems and keep the supplier afloat so that we could keep feeding our production lines. We also experienced some difficulties with suppliers who had resourced some components into places like Tunisia, which looked a good deal and worked pretty well at the beginning, but of course got badly disrupted by the political situation in Tunisia last year, which gave a lot of issues and resulted in us having to repatriate work back into Europe, or to look for more stable places to complete the components. So those situations caused a lot of disturbance in the line. They drove us to take a lot of extraordinary actions. I think we see the evidence that that's moving in a good direction. Our delivery performance is very, very good. At the end of May, we had almost missed nothing in terms of delivery. We had a couple of aircraft on single aisle that were held up, mainly for commercial issues, not for industrial or technical issues. So that gives us a hope that we're getting the situation under control. I think we've done a lot to make sure that happens. But we don't take it for granted, and we still have more work to do to make sure we keep it secure. And our other message, of course, to our suppliers is they need to be thinking about how could we go further. Because certainly after we introduce NEO, we can easily imagine going to rates like 44 a month, and in fact, as we go towards the end of the decade, rate 50 a month. So there's a lot of things that are further down the road that we need to make sure we've got a very strong industrial flow and that we've got a repeating system that can be well managed. We don't need to make decisions on these things today, but we need to have people orientated in their long-term thinking. Part of our commitment to that, of course, is things like our FAL in China and our FAL in North America. I was with Fabrice a few weeks ago when we did the groundbreaking in Mobile. I have to say I was actually overwhelmed by the reaction we got locally. Tremendous pride in the people to see Airbus opening a facility there, and a great enthusiasm. And of course, the logic of our investment in Mobile is that we expect to get a bigger market share. And I'm sure John will touch on that when he talks to you tomorrow. But we have a sense that in spite of our $10 billion a year, $10 billion a year that we spend in North America, we're not seen to be particularly local citizens, let's put it that way. And so therefore it was a strong requirement for us to overcome that problem. While there may not be huge growth in North America, there is a big replacement fleet potential, and we need to make sure we're well positioned to do that. And today, to have a situation where we have 15 or 16% market share in North America is not satisfactory, and we need to get to the 40 or 50% that we aspire to in other places. So we're very enthusiastic about our new FAL in Mobile, and we think that will help us to achieve our global ambitions. And it's another step, I think, in the globalization of Airbus. We're starting to build product in each of our big international markets. I think you know the overall statistics. I think maybe the key point to make there is the operational reliability one. As we've driven the product up, some people might say, well, quality suffers as you've churned out more stuff. It's in fact the reverse. We're continuing to improve the product. And if you look at the overall fleet, in fact, of the last 250 aircraft delivered, the average operational reliability is 99.8. So very impressive performance. Again, a very similar product evolution plan to the one that you saw previously. The NEO is a big part of that, and Klaus Roewe will talk to you more about where we are on the NEO program, because it's absolutely essential to how we drive things forward. But you'll also see on there things like the Sharklets. Sharklets have gone exceptionally well. A lot of customers now finding more than 4% improvement in terms of fuel burn improvement. The electronic flight bag, on-airport navigation, again, ROPS, the same as long range. SpaceFlex, because particularly for the LCCs, seat count is absolutely crucial. So we're looking at every opportunity to optimize seat count, and we've got things like Cabin Flex, Smart Labs, where we're looking at reducing the density of the non-value added piece on the aeroplane and getting the maximum real estate for seats so that the LCCs can generate the kind of returns that they need. And it's a very competitive situation on seat count between ourselves and Boeing, particularly with the LCCs. We're looking at further evolutions, things like e-taxi, which is how could we have an engineless taxi? Because while it's something like a Sharklet, bringing 3.5–4% fuel burn improvement is great if you're flying the right missions. If you're flying an hour and a half or whatever, you're really going to get the benefit of Sharklet in terms of fuel burn, because the aircraft will climb, it'll fly at optimum altitude, and it'll fly there long enough that you get the aerodynamic improvement to make up for the weight of these extra components that you've got to put on. But if you're flying from, say, Paris to Frankfurt, first of all, you're never going to get to that optimum cruising altitude in the overcrowded European airspace anyway, especially with the air traffic problems that we have in Europe. So you're in a situation where you need to think about other alternatives, and especially in very complex airports like Charles de Gaulle and Frankfurt, where there's long taxiways, lots of time waiting, queuing, etc. Then doing that without the engines running, with something like e-taxi, with electric motors driving the main landing gear, using only the power coming from the APU, can be much more efficient in terms of fuel burn. So we're delighted to keep working on that. We're working with our friends at Safran, looking at the integration of the landing gear and the control system. It's got some technical challenges. I think for those of you that will be at Le Bourget, you'll probably see some demonstration of it. So that's probably another kind of example of the things that we're trying to do to improve performance. The Sharklets, I think I've touched on that. The program's been very successful. We're now working through the rest of the certification of all of the different engine options and aircraft options, and I think delivered on time and delivering better performance than we had in the business case. So we're really pleased with the way that's going. So that's it for me in terms of the serial programs. I'm happy to take questions, but maybe, Marcella, what we could do is, do you want Stefan to let Klaus do his piece, and then Klaus and I will take Q&As together if you don't mind. And then there's less chance of you falling asleep.